Right now, as you are watching this, families in Indianapolis are being told to leave their homes immediately. Not pack a bag for later, not keep an eye on the forecast, leave now. The floodgates protecting one of the city's own neighborhoods are being sealed shut as we speak because the river behind them has climbed high enough that the levees holding it back are sitting right at the edge of failure. This is day 6 of a flooding disaster that is rewriting Indiana's weather history in real time, and I need to be honest with you about something before we go any further. It is not over. More rain is in the forecast for today and more again tomorrow, falling on ground that is already so saturated it has nowhere left to send the water except into rivers that are already breaking records set more than a century ago. I want to walk you through this whole situation the way I always do, not to scare you, but so you actually understand what's happening, why it happened, and most importantly, what the next 2 days look like for the people still in the path of this. Because this isn't a story that ends with the rain stopping. Rivers don't work that way. Even after the sky clears, the water still has to travel downstream, and for a lot of communities in this state, the worst of that journey hasn't arrived yet. Let's start with what's happening in Indianapolis right now, because it's the most urgent piece of this whole event. In the middle of the night, the city issued the highest level of emergency alert available, sent directly to phones across a specific stretch of neighborhoods along the White River. The message was blunt: get out immediately. Public works crews are closing the floodgates that protect this area, something they had already warned residents was coming days in advance. If you live anywhere along that stretch of river, near the neighborhoods closest to the water, this is not a precaution. This is happening. Here's why that evacuation order exists. The White River, at the gauge that monitors this part of the city, normally reaches flood stage at 6 feet. Right now it's forecast to crest today at more than double that, over 12.5 feet. At that level, the water isn't just high, it's sitting at the very top of the earthen levee, built specifically to keep it out of the neighborhood behind it. And a levee at the top of its capacity isn't a stable situation. Any additional rise, any weak point in that barrier that engineers haven't caught, and you get what's called overtopping, or worse, an outright breach. That's the scenario the city is trying to get ahead of by closing the gates and clearing people out before it happens rather than after. Move a little further along the same river toward the northeast side of the city, and the picture gets even more extreme. That stretch of the White River sits at a normal flood stage of 11 feet. As of the middle of the night, it had already climbed to over 17 feet, and forecasters expect it to keep rising through the afternoon, approaching 20.5 feet. That number matters because it puts this event within reach of the highest water level ever recorded at that location. At that height, floodwater is expected to close in on a major roadway, submerge entire residential pockets under several feet of water, and cut off access to parts of the city that flooding simply doesn't normally touch. And this isn't a warning that expires tomorrow. It stays in effect for days. But if you want to understand just how historic this event actually is, you have to look north to the communities just outside Indianapolis, because that's where the records aren't just being challenged, they're being obliterated. In one river town in Hamilton County, the White River hit a level overnight that shattered a flood record that had stood since 1913, over a century of recorded history, and this event broke it in a single night. Just a bit further northeast, in Madison County, the same river hit an even higher peak, smashing another 1913-era record that had defined flood history in that community for generations. Think about what that actually means. Somewhere back in 1913, a flood happened that was bad enough that people spent the next 100+ years using it as the benchmark for the worst case scenario. Every flood since then got measured against it. And this week, in the span of days, that benchmark got thrown out entirely. I want to pause on that for a second because I think it's easy to hear breaks a 100-year record and let the phrase wash over you without really sitting with it. A 100-year flood, in the way meteorologists and engineers use that term, doesn't mean it happens exactly once every 100 years like clockwork. It means that in any given year, there's roughly a 1% chance of an event that's severe occurring. When you hear forecasters describing parts of this rainfall event as having odds closer to 1 in 1,000 for any given year, you're talking about an event so far outside the range of what infrastructure, drainage systems, and levees were designed to handle that unprecedented isn't hyperbole, it's just the accurate word. Behind those numbers are real people, and I think that matters more than any statistic. A 70-year-old man in one of the hardest hit towns had just finished renovating his home 2 months ago. This week it flooded completely, and he described it to a reporter in the simplest, most devastating terms, saying he doesn't know how he starts over financially at 70 years old. Another resident of the same town lost both his home and his business in the same event, describing feeling completely wiped out with water standing several feet deep throughout the property. In one small town in the eastern part of the state, rescue crews had to pull people out of the water by boat after floodwaters filled entire streets, including one man who ended up clinging to a light pole in the middle of a flooded roadway, holding on against the current until rescuers could reach him. Another resident, describing what it was like watching the rain simply never stop for days, said his community received well over 11 inches of rain in just over 24 hours, an amount so extreme that forecasters again use that same 1-in-1,000-year language to describe it. That these aren't abstract statistics on a weather map. This is what a stalled, historic rainfall event actually does to the people living inside it. And this isn't just a White River story. Indiana's largest river system, the Wabash, is dealing with its own version of this disaster stretching across the western half of the state. In the northern stretch near Lafayette, the river is running more than 6 feet above flood stage, with extensive flooding covering farmland, closing state roads, and putting local parks completely underwater. Moving south, communities along the same river are watching it climb toward crests that in some spots won't happen until Monday or Tuesday of next week, meaning the Wabash hasn't even peaked yet in several locations. Further south still, in one of the larger cities along the river, forecasters expect flooding to reach a point where the entire western portion of the city sits underwater, with a flood warning that doesn't expire for more than a week from now. In the northwest part of the state, a separate river system is dealing with its own rise, closing a federal highway and threatening homes along at least one residential street, with the crest not expected until sometime early next week. And in the southeastern portion of Indiana, an entirely different piece of the White River system, the East Fork, is essentially getting its turn on a delay. Some stretches of that river are still climbing toward flood stage even now, days after the rain that caused all of this actually fell, because rivers move downstream on their own timeline, not the timeline of the storm that filled them. In some of those southern communities, the crest isn't expected until early Tuesday, with warnings that stretch out for close to another full week beyond that. This is what river flooding does that a lot of people don't intuitively understand. It doesn't happen all at once across an entire state and then go away all at once. It moves. What starts as a rainfall event over one part of the state becomes a slow-motion wave working its way downstream through the entire river network, arriving in different communities on different days, sometimes nearly 2 weeks after the rain that originally caused it. Getting around the state right now is its own disaster on top of the flooding itself. A major interstate is closed in one direction after a section of pavement actually buckled under the sustained saturation, an interstate highway physically failing from water damage. A historic federal highway is closed in both directions in one county. A state road in the same area has an entire section of roadway simply washed away, gone, with crews blocking both sides and warning drivers not to even attempt it. In one town, a residential road collapsed outright, exposing a deep, water-filled cavity underneath what used to be solid pavement, essentially the ground swallowing the road itself. Multiple school districts have delayed or canceled the start of their school year entirely because roads serving their buildings are impassable. And there's a public health warning layered on top of all of this that deserves your full attention if you're anywhere near this flooding. Emergency officials in one of the hardest hit counties have specifically warned that floodwater in the area has mixed with sewage, gasoline, and other hazardous material from surrounding properties and infrastructure. Contaminated water like that can release toxic gases, and exposure has been linked to sudden nausea, severe headaches, burning eyes, sore throat, and difficulty breathing. This isn't a watch your step kind of warning. This is a genuine public health hazard, and if you're anywhere near this flooding, do not wade through it. Do not let kids play in it, and treat every bit of standing water as potentially contaminated, because in a lot of these areas, it is. So how did an event this extreme actually happen? Because understanding the mechanism behind it is what tells you why this isn't over yet. It started days before the flooding did, with a violent line of straight-line windstorms, the kind meteorologists call a derecho, tearing through the Midwest. Wind gusts hit nearly 100 miles an hour in one Indiana city, with other locations recording gusts well above 90. Trees came down, power lines came down, and hundreds of thousands of people lost electricity in a single event. That storm alone would have been a major story on its own in a normal week. But what it also did was leave the ground across the state already stressed and saturated right before the real problem arrived. That real problem was a weather front that got stuck. Normally, a front moves through a region over the course of a day or two and keeps going. This one parked itself directly over Indiana and the surrounding Ohio Valley and simply refused to move. With that boundary locked in place, thunderstorm complexes kept forming and tracking over the exact same stretch of ground day after day after day, a phenomenon meteorologists call training, like trained cars running on the same section of track over and over. At the same time, the broader weather pattern was pulling in an enormous plume of tropical moisture straight up from the Gulf of Mexico, with atmospheric moisture levels reaching values you'd expect to see ahead of a hurricane, not over the Midwest in the middle of August. Put those three ingredients together, an already saturated ground from the derecho, a stalled front-locking storms in place over the same communities repeatedly, and a hurricane-level moisture feed pouring in from the Gulf, and you get 6 consecutive days of extreme rainfall, well over 100 separate flash flood incidents across the broader region since the pattern began, and multiple official flash flood emergencies declared in a single week. The state has since declared a statewide disaster emergency, activated the National Guard, and requested a federal disaster declaration to unlock additional resources. At least 3 deaths have been confirmed as directly storm-related, with additional fatalities from the initial windstorm still under investigation. In one especially harrowing moment, a toddler in a rural county nearly drowned before a nearby farmer was able to assist emergency responders in getting her out safely, a reminder of just how fast this kind of event can turn from inconvenience to life-threatening in seconds. Now here's the part I think matters most, because it's the part that determines what happens over the next 2 days, and I want to be straight with you about where the real uncertainty sits. The forecast for today carries what meteorologists classify as a moderate risk of excessive rainfall over the eastern central part of the state. And that classification specifically means at least a 40% chance of rain falling faster than the ground can safely absorb it, within a 25-mile radius of essentially any point in that zone. And remember, this rain is falling onto ground that is functionally at 100% saturation already. There's nowhere for new rainfall to go except directly into rivers that are already at or near record levels. Forecasters specifically describe this kind of setup as hydrologically sensitive, meaning even a moderate amount of additional rain can trigger a disproportionately severe flooding response, because the usual buffer dry soil that can soak some of it up simply doesn't exist right now. Tomorrow's forecast is, if anything, more concerning. A separate moderate risk of excessive rainfall has been issued for a corridor stretching from the eastern part of Indiana into central Ohio. Some forecast models are showing 2 to 4 inches of rain or more falling in that corridor in a single day, on top of everything that's already happened this week. Some of the probability modeling for that specific window has flagged the low-end potential for what's classified as a 100-year rainfall event, again in an area that has already been dealing with a flooding disaster for 6 straight days. In plain language, there is a real chance that after already breaking century-old flood records, part of this region sees another historically extreme rainfall event tomorrow, layered directly on top of a situation that hasn't recovered from the first one. There's also a secondary severe weather risk to be aware of for tomorrow. Parts of the state sit in a lower-end risk zone for organized thunderstorms capable of producing damaging wind gusts, with a higher-end risk just to the east across the broader Ohio Valley region. The atmospheric ingredients in play, strong wind shear, high available energy, and that same extreme atmospheric moisture mean that any storm that does organize has the potential to produce very heavy rainfall very quickly, which only compounds the flooding risk rather than existing as a separate concern. I want to be honest about the confidence level here, because I think that matters more than sounding certain about every single detail. The broad shape of this forecast, continued rain today, a genuine risk of another extreme rainfall event tomorrow, and a slow multi-day recession of river levels after that is something forecasters have real confidence in. It's been consistent across multiple forecast updates. What's less certain is the exact placement of the heaviest rain bands within that broader risk zone, which specific communities end up seeing the 2 to 4 inch totals versus the lower end of that range. That kind of granular detail can still shift meaningfully in the final hours before it happens. So if you're in the affected area, treat the broad risk as solid and keep checking for updates on the specific placement. Let's actually walk through what the rivers themselves are expected to do over the next 2 days, because this is where the abstract forecast becomes something you can plan around if you live along any of these waterways. In the Indianapolis area, the river is expected to crest today at levels that approach the highest ever recorded at that gauge, before beginning a slow decline. Just south of the city, A separate stretch of the same river isn't even expected to crest until Wednesday, days from now, with a rural road closure expected as a direct result. Further south along that same river, another community won't see its crest until Thursday afternoon, with a state highway between two towns expected to flood as a result. To the southeast, one river gauge that hasn't even reached flood stage yet is forecast to cross that threshold Sunday afternoon and keep rising into early Tuesday, with the warning covering that location staying active for close to a full week. Along the Wabash, one major city's crest isn't expected until Monday afternoon, with the warning there running all the way into the following weekend. And in the north, a flood watch covers an additional county starting early this morning, with rainfall rates of 1 to 2 inches per hour possible, a reminder that even areas that have felt relatively spared so far need to stay alert through today and into tonight. So when does this actually end? There is some genuinely good news buried in all of this. The stalled weather pattern responsible for the whole event is expected to finally shift eastward around the middle of next week, with drier, warmer conditions moving in as a ridge of high pressure builds in from the Great Lakes region and cuts off the moisture feed that's been fueling this for 6 days. The northeastern part of the state will likely see improvement first as that high pressure arrives. But here's the part I want you to really understand, because it's the piece that gets lost once the rain itself stops falling on the news cycle. River flooding does not end when the rain ends. All of that water sitting in the upper parts of these river systems still has to physically travel downstream, and that process takes time, sometimes more than a week. Communities along the Wabash River corridor are expected to remain in flood conditions well into the following weekend and beyond. Southeastern communities along the East Fork of the White River won't see levels drop below flood stage for close to another week after that. And in some of the southwestern parts of the state, flooding along the river hasn't even started yet, as of today, with warnings there not expiring until close to 2 weeks from now. For a lot of communities in the western and southwestern parts of this state, the worst of this event from their perspective is still ahead of them. The flood wave is still moving downstream toward them, even as things start to improve closer to where the rain originally fell. I want to walk you through what this actually looks like for someone living through the part of this that's still coming, because I think it makes the risk more real than a river gauge number does on its own. Picture a family in one of these downstream communities along the Wabash or the East Fork, somewhere that, as of today, hasn't seen serious flooding yet. They've watched the news all week, seen the images from Indianapolis and Noblesville and Anderson, and maybe felt a little bit of distance from it because their town hasn't flooded. Then the forecast updates, and their local river gauge, which has been sitting well below flood stage the entire time, is now projected to cross it within the next day or two, with a crest still several days out. After that, that's the trap in an event like this. The parts of the state that got hit first are already starting to see relief, while communities that felt like spectators to the disaster all week suddenly find themselves square in its path, with less warning time than the communities upstream had, because the story has already moved on in a lot of people's minds, even though the water hasn't finished arriving. That's exactly why the National Weather Service keeps repeating the same core piece of safety guidance through every single stage of an event like this, and I want to make sure it lands with you directly, because it is the single most important thing in this entire script. The leading cause of death in flood events isn't a house getting swept away, it's vehicles. It's people driving into water on a road, consistently underestimating both the depth and the force of moving water. 6 inches of fast-moving floodwater is enough to knock an adult off their feet. 2 feet of water is enough to float a car entirely, and once a vehicle starts moving with the current, the odds of getting out safely drop fast. You cannot judge the depth of water covering a road by looking at it. You cannot judge how fast it's moving. And you absolutely cannot tell whether the road underneath that water has already been washed out, the way we've already seen happen multiple times this week across this exact state. And if you see water across a road, the answer is always the same every single time, with no exceptions for how well you know that road under normal conditions. Turn around. Do not drown. That guidance matters even more once it gets dark, because it becomes far harder to recognize standing water and moving water at night, right when a lot of people are driving home from work or checking on family. And if you hear rushing water anywhere near where you are, get to higher ground immediately. Don't wait to confirm what it is first. And if local officials in your area issue an evacuation order, the answer to that is the same as it is for flooded roads. Leave. Don't wait to see how bad it actually gets. Don't go back for belongings. Everything in a flooded house can potentially be replaced. People cannot. Let me pull this all together into the version you can actually act on. If you're anywhere in this state right now, or if you have family or friends who are If you're near the White River in or around Indianapolis, especially in any neighborhood under an active evacuation order, that order is not a suggestion, and it exists because engineers are watching levees sitting at their structural limits right now. If you're in one of the communities upstream or downstream along the Wabash or the East Fork of the White River, understand that your community's crest may still be days away, even if the rain stops today, and check your specific river gauge rather than assuming your town is in the clear just because the worst of the coverage has moved elsewhere. If you're anywhere in the moderate risk zone for excessive rainfall over the next 2 days, treat any additional rain as landing on ground that has zero capacity left to absorb it, which means flash flooding can happen faster and more severely than the rainfall amount alone would suggest. And if you're near any of the flooding directly, take the contamination warnings seriously. This isn't ordinary rainwater anymore in a lot of these areas. It's mixed with sewage and fuel and hazardous material from the surrounding properties. And exposure carries real health risks beyond just the danger of the water itself. Step back and look at the full shape of this event because I think it's important to actually understand it rather than just feel generally alarmed by it. This started with a violent windstorm that stressed the ground across an entire state. It escalated because a weather front got stuck in place and refused to move for nearly a week. It intensified because the atmosphere was pulling in a level of moisture you'd expect ahead of a tropical system, not over the Midwest in August. And it's still unfolding because rivers don't operate on the same timeline as the storms that fill them, meaning communities that haven't seen a drop of floodwater yet are still squarely in this event's path. Century-old flood records didn't just get challenged this week, they got shattered in some cases by more than a full foot of additional water height at multiple locations across the same state within days of each other. I'll be tracking this as it continues to develop, especially the forecast for tomorrow's rainfall and any changes to evacuation orders